Good afternoon, distinguished participants, and thank you very much for joining us for this really exciting GNF session organized by NASA on the topic Moon to Mars objectives. It's my great pleasure to introduce the guest speaker for this session, Pam MELROY, NASA Deputy Administrator and former NASA astronaut, and one of only 2 women to command a space shuttle. Mrs. Melroy logged more than 38 days, 924 hours in space. She served as a pilot on 2 flights, STS-92 in 2000 and STS-112 in 2002, and was the mission commander on STS-120 in 2007. All 3 of her missions were assembly missions to build the International Space Station. After serving more than 2 decades in the Air Force and as a NASA astronaut, Pam MELROY took a number of leadership roles, including at Lockheed Martin, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, Nova System Australia, and as an advisor to the Australian Space Agency. She also served as an independent consultant and as a member of the National Space Council User Advisory Group. Please give a warm round of applause for our speaker, Pam MELROY.
Thank you, Pascale. Thank you. Thank you so much, Pascale. It's wonderful to be here. A year ago at IAC in Dubai, he had been in my position maybe just a few months, and Administrator Bill Nelson and our Associate Administrator Bob Cabana and I were talking a lot about how to ensure the future of our Moon to Mars program. Now, I think probably most people in the room know that Artemis 1 is sitting on the launch pad. We hope to have a successful test tomorrow, and we'll launch, we hope, on the next opportunity, which is September 27th. We have hardware all the way through Artemis 4, and even a few things starting for Artemis 5 in work. We understand those missions. What we need to do are to have successful test missions, test flights, and to, of course, test all the hardware and the opportunity on Artemis 3 to land the first woman and the next man on the moon. And Artemis 4 will help us with the next step, which is building the gateway. This is really about how do we ensure that we are focused on the things that we are doing when we go with our commercial and international partners to the moon, that we are focused on the destination. We know that we want to practice on the moon to go to Mars, and that was the beginning of the discussion. So a year ago, I talked about an objectives-based approach as opposed to a capabilities-based approach. Well, we have done a lot of work since a year ago, and I'm here to give you an update and tell you about what's going on. So at the anniversary earlier this month of President Kennedy's "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech at Rice University, Administrator Nelson said, "With inspiration and innovation, no Herculean effort is too large. No moonshot is beyond our reach. It's a mission about science and the advancement of the human spirit to expand what is possible. We are choosing again to go to the moon. But this is an unprecedented time when we have capabilities and interests of many nations and industry poised to do possibly the hardest but most transformational thing we believe humans have done. This is a new generation of exploration. And just as Apollo inspired my generation, including me, a whole wave of people to go into science and engineering, mathematics, explorers and aviators, and other technical careers, we know that the Artemis generation is going to do the same and create a new wave of explorers. One of the questions when we are talking outside of the space community, I think a broader community, these things are obvious to us. What are the benefits to humanity of what we are doing? So it's important to understand that we took the time to go back to what I call, as a physicist, first principles. Why do we go to space? I think it's very important to articulate whenever we have the opportunity, even to ourselves who understand it. I have talked to a lot of people, and I've thought deeply about this for a long time. And this chart represents what we think the benefits, particularly to humanity and to the citizens of Earth, that going to space represents. Some of you may find one area more compelling than others. That is often the case. But I will say that we are at our most powerful when we can bring together all aspects of these three areas. And I'll start out with science. As we can see with the James Webb Space Telescope, which is teaching us about the foundations and the formations of our cosmos. And there's some very interesting foundational physics questions that have yet to be answered, which may in fact help us understand lots of other things about the universe that we may be able to harness. I go back in my mind to the foundational knowledge of how atoms, the structure of an atom, and how that's led to so many things like laser physics, which is a critical part of everyday life. So science is very, very important. We learn about the cosmos, we learn about the solar system, we learn about our own planet, and we learn about our own biology. And that is a very, very foundational reason for why we go to space. In addition to that, we go for national leadership and capability. One thing that we know is that capability in technology and science never is restricted to just one area. It benefits all the citizens in a country when you have that foundation, when you have that capability, because it allows you to solve a multiple of problems that you may have. And so having that capability and that investment in scientific and technological capability is incredibly important. In addition to that, we know that international relationships are the way of the future, and there is nothing more global than going to space. It's very obvious. When you go to space and you look down, you see no political divisions. All you see is the Earth, which is our spaceship, and we are its crew members together. And finally, we go for inspiration. And of course, some of these areas overlap. If you weren't inspired by the thought of being a member of Spaceship Earth, well, I hope you were. So that's a perspective about global cooperation, but it's also an inspiration about humanity and what humanity means in our condition, our human condition going forward. It's also very important to encourage our next generation of explorers through STEM. One of the things that's interesting about this is that I think about our industry partners, and they have their own why. And they have no obligation or responsibility to worry about benefits to humanity or citizens. They might think about it, but they have their own why. Only the governments of the world think this way. What value are we providing? That's our purpose. So when I look at the why, these are first principles that we went all the way back to in our Moon to Mars strategy. So we gathered senior leaders across the agency, across all of our mission directorates, to start discussing what our objectives would be for a long-term human presence on the Moon, and always with an eye to Mars, and how we can transfer what we learn at the Moon to go forward to future destinations. So one of the most important first steps was to look at the principles. So I talked about an objectives-based approach. In the past, we have said we will create capabilities and then do whatever those capabilities will enable us to do. Really, to truly be aspirational and strategic, we have to have objectives. We have to know what the goal is. Even if we know we're not fully ready to do everything yet, we have to start with those objectives. In addition to that, we had a founding principle that was to architect from the right and execute from the left. And what I mean by that is set your aspirational goal, that's the distance all the way to the right, and then acknowledge the fact that we have capabilities. We have a rocket on the launch pad, the most powerful rocket in the world, capable of taking, and then Orion, which can take people into deep space, protect them, and bring them home. So we have existing capabilities, and we know that. We're not starting with a clean sheet of paper. So we knew that we needed to start with our aspiration, look where we are, and meet in the middle. In addition to that, our third point was we need to stay with a consistent plan. We believe the objectives will help us do that. It's a framework that enables us to say at a very high level, what are the signposts, what are the guideposts for our architecture going forward. You won't see anywhere in the objectives how many pounds of thrust, how many pounds of cargo. These are at a higher level. It's talking about what are the things that we need to demonstrate and develop to going forward. And that's very important to have a consistent plan that we can then fill in those capabilities as we go forward. Articulating our goals and objectives, well, that's what I'm doing here today. We recognize that we want partners from all over the world and from industry, and how do you know how to share in the effort and become a part of the Moon to Mars team going out into the solar system, unless you know what it is we are doing. But more importantly, it's not just our own effort. We have to be consultative about those objectives. So articulating them, but then also refining them with input. And finally, overall enhanced communication and engagement. This isn't just about us, our space community. My old friends, many old friends in the audience, we really need to engage the world on this. And to do that, we have to do better communication. We have to share everything that we're doing. So, our overarching goal is to create a blueprint for sustained human presence and exploration throughout the solar system. This is very important. It shapes what we're going to do in the future, to say, no, we're going to learn on the moon, and then we're going to demonstrate it in a repeatable way. It's going to become a blueprint, not just for Mars, but for any destination out in the solar system. How do we do this? What comes first? What's most important? What will we learn? That is our overarching goal. We took the objectives and created them into 4 basic areas: transportation and habitation, science, infrastructure, and operations. And we knew that each one of these areas would be very, very important. I think I just want to take a couple of moments to talk about each one of these. Science, of course, is part of the why. So it's front and center. Why are we going? What do we hope to learn? What do we need to learn before we send a human to do science? We're very good at remote science, but we're still learning about how to use humans. We're doing it on the space station in a shirt sleeve environment, but now we will be doing it on the surface of the moon, and what's the best way to do that? And that links with operations. How can we best take advantage of human health and performance operating on the surface of another planet? Transportation and habitation, that's obvious. We're already working on many elements of that. And then finally, infrastructure. Infrastructure is critical to NASA. On the moon, it's a 3-day trip. So we can get a lot of science done. 3-day trip there, 30 days worth of science coming back. That's productive. That's productive. But one thing that we learned with the space shuttle is that eventually that's not enough. And that's why we built the space station, so that we could do science 24/7. If you're going to send humans into space, which is quite challenging, you should be getting the most science for that effort. So the moon we can do fairly easily, but when we start going deeper into the solar system, look at Mars as a simple example, 6 months there, 6 months back. If we're doing 30 days of science on the surface, that's okay for a test mission and to begin to understand, but ultimately we're going to need to know how to support humans in deep space if we're really going to do science and if we're really serious about that. So we have to have the infrastructure, and that's communications, that's power, that's the ability to use resources in situ, to minimize the logistics train that you have to bring with you every single time you go. We have to have landing pads, navigation and timing, all of those things, very, very critical aspects. So, what we did over the last year was our team began to work on the objectives. And then we took that set of draft objectives out to the public for comment, and we received over 5,000 inputs from the public, from industry, and from our international partners. We held workshops with industry and our international partners this past summer to get further refinements, especially thinking about gaps or where we needed to add something. And I really want to thank all of the institutions and the individuals, academia, industry, international partners, individually and as institutions, who supported this tremendous effort. We took all 5,000 plus of those inputs and thought very carefully about how to use them. We really want to create objectives that can sustain and be resilient across administrations and budget cycles, that we really have a consensus. Perhaps, if you like, maybe like a decadal survey, if you will. But we also have to have enough flexibility to add new technologies and also address all the other changes that will happen in the world as we know it over the next 2 decades. So while retaining our focus on success for Artemis in the near term, our Moon to Mars objectives ensure that we have a comprehensive framework that supports all our exploration goals in the future. And these objectives will guide the success of our strategy going forward through the return of astronauts to the Moon, lunar science and exploration, and all the way to the first crewed landing on Mars. So I'd like to actually share now some of the specifics about how we changed the draft objectives and talk about what we learned through this conversation. So I'll start with some very broad levels of input. Many voices expressed very similar sentiments from all 4 feedback paths. And the first 3 that were brought up most consistently, I'm sharing here throughout all of our engagement campaigns. So our science objectives were completely restructured. So it was noted that we had a variety. They weren't always consistent with each other. Some were very broad and some were very specific. So the goal was to try to harmonize our objectives, science objectives, and bring them to the same level. And more importantly, they didn't include Mars. So that's kind of important. We do have to know what we need to learn at Mars before we send humans. It makes sense. We've been learning so much. We just celebrated 25 years of rovers on Mars at NASA, and we have learned so much. But now it's time to get very specific about what those science objectives need to be. So the restructuring allowed us also to look at a vast array of human exploration science. And we also added a couple new categories: science-enabled and applied science objectives. And this is actually about the connective tissue between our objectives, which are interrelated. So in some cases, our science objectives have to support other objectives. And for example, science can help us understand how to use resources in ISRU in situ. So we had that as an infrastructure objective, but science can support it. We also heard that we need to feed forward sustained Mars and destinations beyond. And we recognize that for every planetary body, we're going to have 2 reasons to be there. First, we want to practice for the next step, but we also want to have some presence. But at first, we just drew the line and said, okay, we made the decision to bound the scope to infrastructure for the Moon at first because of all the uncertainty and the things we knew we'd have to learn, only for the initial campaign for now. But we heard loud and clear, there was common feedback, we've got to put in hooks or stretch goals that also support a sustained presence on Mars. So we did add some objectives in that area. We also heard loud and clear the desire for continued engagement, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The workshop was not one and done with our consultation. I'll talk about that in a few minutes, but we are going to plan a regular cadence so that we continually have input into the architecture and also to the objectives. And finally, one of the key themes that we heard was about interoperability and the desire for commonality in technical solutions, ops concepts, and process standards. So we included interoperability as one of our newly defined recurring tenets, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I do want to share, I don't know if it's a little bit of an eye chart, some of the concrete changes that we did make in specific objectives. So I'll start with one which was about payload size. So our original objectives, we had 4 that included the terms in transportation and habitation, where we used the term large to describe the payload or cargo size. And feedback helped us realize, hey, that's limiting. We really want a range of capabilities. There are some things that are optimized for smaller cargo loads and then some for larger. Field geology. While we'd previously accounted for the desire to conduct field geology, we're now including the importance of mission-specific, in-depth science training for the astronauts, something we did in Apollo. So that was a great one, a great piece of feedback. We've also broadened it to account for transformational science on the Moon, for Mars, and also in deep space in general. Responsible use. Well, I think that was so obvious to all of us, we missed it. We just believed that it was consistent with our responsibility obligations, and it was something that we just assumed, but it wasn't explicitly stated. As I mentioned, communications are really important. So shown here are just a couple of examples, very specific, of how responsible use was incorporated into those refined objectives based on your feedback. In addition, one of our new recurring tenets is also geared towards our commitment to responsible behavior. Remote sensing was another area that wasn't reflected explicitly, but it's a capability we need to support human-led science campaigns. So thanks to your input, we've now included language in the objectives to capture that need. So keep in mind, these are just a few examples of the changes that we've made. We'll be releasing that shortly. I will put up a QR code, but today is the announcement of those updated objectives. And I hope that you recognize yourselves and the inputs that you made and the difference that you've made across the board. So just to kind of summarize the changes, I've given you just a taste and a flavor. I'm not reading all 63 to you, but we started with 50 draft objectives. We now have 63. We had 10 top-level goals. And then we discovered that there were these recurring themes that we kept having to either write over and over across our objectives, or we were implying by the nature and the tone of our objectives, even if we hadn't written them down. And so they were so fundamental, we decided to make sure that we captured that, and that's, we had initially identified 4 of those themes, but we've changed that to now recurring tenets and put them in their own track, and after input from our stakeholders, the list is expanded to 9. So these 9 tenets are very clearly stated near the beginning of the summary that we're releasing today, so you can see how all of the objectives are influenced by them in some way. It's important to understand, I've also asked our Exploration Systems Directorate to think about figures of merit and success criteria for each of the objectives, and also for the recurring tenets. We don't want them to get left behind because they're assumed and not explicit in each objective. They need to be considered for every aspect of the architecture. A couple of the important ones, I'll just touch on them, is international collaboration and industry collaboration, maintainability and reuse, responsible use, as I mentioned before, interoperability, and also leveraging low Earth orbit, the things that we're already doing in low Earth orbit. That makes sense. We want to take advantage of what we've got. It's a part of execute from the left. So I want to look ahead. First, there will be an ongoing cycle of near-term and further-term work. We'll be giving more targeted attention to the gaps in our architecture and sharing that with our industry and international partners. And we're going to be revisiting the architecture on an annual basis. Throughout it all of this, our watchwords are refinement, analysis and review, and engagement. And that's a cycle we intend to repeat. I'd like to particularly point out We are doing an architecture concept review that will be completed in January, but we're going to try to shift the cycle to align with our budget cycle towards the October timeframe. And then once a year, we will roll out the refined architecture. We will take inputs that will feed into the next cycle. In addition to that, to enhance the transparency of what we're doing, we will have white papers that will talk about assumptions and trade space, so that it's very clear how we got to the conclusion what was needed into the architecture. So we're really proud of what we're rolling out to you today as our refined and improved Moon to Mars objectives. We're going to continue to revisit these objectives in the years ahead as our architectures mature, new knowledge comes to light, and more stakeholders come to the table. So you can scan this QR code to get to our release and take a look at our recurring tenets and our objectives together. They will serve as the blueprint for the next 2 decades or more, and they'll be the connective tissue between all of us, between the capabilities, between Moon and on to Mars. This is a pretty exciting challenge. We are trying to figure out how to go into the solar system for peaceful scientific exploration, and we need to do it together. So I thank you for your interest. I thank you for your participation today. I think I may have time for one question if I've got it. Let's see. How will international partners participate in the objectives going forward? So it's our intention to have this regular cadence, as I mentioned, once a year. The first architectural concept review will be completed at the end of January, and shortly thereafter we will have a consultation, another event with our international partners. That's going to be a little bit more focused, not just on the objectives, which we think, we want them to stay relatively stable, but it's about the architecture and really looking at where the gaps are. Are we meeting the objectives with our architecture? Are we doing it? Are we doing everything that we said? We know we're not. I mean, I will just tell you, for example, there's no way we're ready to build a Mars transport vehicle. That is not happening this year and even next year. But we really do need to be thinking about the tech development and the demonstrations that need to be done so that we can make decisions in the early 2030s. So we will be focusing on, I'd like to say, ticking off these objectives. I'm sure it's going to be messier than that. We will learn as we operate on the surface of the Moon, and we're going to take that learning together. But at least once a year, we will have the opportunity to stop and work with our international partners on the architecture, guided by the objectives, and decide what new investments we'll make together. So maybe one more. Can you describe more the future missions that these will apply to? So essentially, we are trying very hard to bring more science forward as soon as we possibly can. I know, because I went through this as an astronaut building the International Space Station. When you're going through assembly missions and you're trying to put things together and test them for the first time, science is something that you want to add as much as possible, but you also have to accomplish the objective of whether it is landing on the Moon or putting together Gateway, testing and planning the logistics and so forth. We'll have a focus on that for the first 4 missions. So I really think, though, that we should take every single precious moment on the surface of the Moon to do science. So you will see more science objectives integrated into Artemis 3, the first landing, and then really kicking in after that. That's my hope. Well, I think that's all I have time for. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your interest, and I especially am so thankful for those of you who participated in any of our workshops, who gave us public feedback. I hope you got the message. We heard you, and you made us better. Thank you.